I've been in Hong Kong now for 30 years, originally from England, but it's always a pleasure coming down to Australia. So thank you very much for the invite. So I'm a feedback researcher. I'm going to talk about feedback. And feedback is something that we're not very good at doing. We're not very good at giving feedback, and we're not very good at receiving feedback. So there's a challenge there, but feedback is something very important and really a critical factor in trying to advance. So we need to define our terms. So at the outset, I'm going to talk a little bit about what feedback is, and it's a fairly slippery term. There's a lot of barriers to effective feedback, and I'll talk about some of them. I'll then go on to have a bit of discussion of some sort of possibilities for feedback, some ways in which we could manage feedback more effectively. And then, as I said, I'm not a learning analytics researcher, I'm a feedback researcher, but I've been doing my prep for this event, and I've been trying to sort of read into learning analytics a little bit, and I'm going to try and draw in the last section some links between feedback and learning analytics. This is something I slaved away for many years, so I hope you won't mind me mentioning this book. It came out in 2015, and what I did is it was a kind of ethnographically style research where I went into classrooms of teachers who'd won teaching awards for good teaching in the university. And I looked at 5 teachers in 5 different disciplines, and I tried to look at some of the things that were going on in their classes. We interviewed the students, and after sort of slaving away at my computer for many years, that product came out. And the framework for that work is on this slide, and it's a term that I claim to have coined in 2003. And funnily enough, I presented it at a conference in Adelaide. So it's the only time I've been to Adelaide before was in 2003 for an Australia Technology Network conference. And I talked a bit about learning-oriented assessment, and it's on this slide. Learning-oriented assessment was an attempt to try to bridge the summative and formative divide. We often complain about summative assessment driving student learning, but that is a reality, and that's in the nature of academia and universities. And of course, university staff, we're the same. We're driven by the performance indicators and what we're going to be evaluated on. So I don't think we can change the fact that summative assessment is the reality. But the argument I put forward in terms of learning-oriented assessment is to try to develop powerful summative assessment. And the kind of summative assessment tasks and the kind of summative assessment designs that are going to get students to do the kind of learning we're looking for. So learning-oriented assessment was a device to try to bridge the summative and formative divide and sort of put it together in a productive way. So the linchpin of learning-oriented assessment is the assessment task design, the kind of assessment tasks the students are doing. And if we have, for example, a coherent series of assessment tasks, then there's more opportunity for the feedback processes, the peer feedback, the learning from teacher feedback to come into play. So that's the 2 elements at the bottom of the diagram. The student engagement with feedback. And in order to engage with feedback, students need to have an appreciation of what quality is in whatever they're trying to do. So learners in university need to have an understanding and appreciation of what a good essay looks like, what a good project involves and looks like, what is a good oral presentation. And as academics, we need to have a sense of what is a good research grant, what is a good journal article, what is a good literature review. So the argument is that in order to make sense of feedback, you need to be developing some kind of connoisseurship, some kind of appreciation of the task that you're tackling. And of course, these things take time. So that's kind of the essence of learning-oriented assessment. So what does feedback mean? The right-hand side box was to do with student engagement with feedback. So that's already an indicator that it's not just what somebody is saying in terms of comments, but it's what the learner makes of it. So they're getting some information about performance, but we're suggesting that there also needs to be some kind of dialogue. Now, by dialogue, I do not mean one teacher, one student, and the teacher giving the student commentary. That is unrealistic in terms of workload, but it also risks creating a dependency of the teacher on the student. Sorry, the student on the teacher. That we want to be creating feedback processes that are sustainable, that they enable the students eventually to learn better from themselves and to self-regulate their performance. So by dialogue, I mean inner dialogue, that kind of internal conversation when you think, how am I going? Do I need to do more of this? Do I need to do less of that? Do I need to elaborate here? Do I cut? Am I running out of time, etc., etc.? So that's the inner dialogue. Then we also argue that the peer is also a very powerful, though sometimes underestimated form of dialogue. So dialogue with the self, dialogue with the peer, and then it could be a dialogue with a machine, it could be with a computer, it could be something telling you whether you're on the right track or not. Then the third element of feedback is action. Unless the comments lead to some kind of uptake and to lead to the learner actually doing something, then it isn't really feedback. It's only feedback if something actually happens. So to put that together, I've got a definition here that, that was in my book. I sort of went away from it a little bit and then I've come back to it, and a couple of colleagues encouraged me to persist with this definition. It's tempting to always go on refining, but sometimes you go back to what you had before. There's quite a lot in that definition, I think. Feedback is a process. So it's not a product, it's not a thing, it's a process. The learners are centrally implicated in it. The learners are making sense, so there's a sense-making element of feedback. The varied sources, as I've indicated, peers, the self, machines, etc. And then they're using it, and they could be using it on a shorter time frame to enhance the quality of their work or their performance, or a longer time frame to enhance their learning strategies or their learning approaches. And I sometimes have a feeling that we spend a bit too much time focused on content, on the actual task that we're working on, and maybe not enough time focusing on the learning strategies. And I think some of the most powerful teaching is helping the students to become much more sophisticated in their use of learning strategies. Because some of them are stuck in not very sophisticated learning strategies for a long period of time. And we often need some support in moving our learning strategies in a more sophisticated way. Okay, so the essence of what I've said so far is that the key element of feedback that many of the feedback researchers are looking for is to enhance the student capacity to self-monitor and self-evaluate their progress while they're doing the work. The students don't want to get the feedback afterwards when it's finished, they've got a bad grade, then they find out what went wrong. They want to be trying to develop the capacities to learn as they go, as it were. In order to do this, they need these kind of internal feedback processes, the metacognition, when they're thinking about what they're doing through the task. And this is just to reinforce the idea. It's still perhaps somewhat controversial, but the idea that information only becomes feedback if some kind of short-term, medium-term, or long-term loop is closed. So the learning theory that I'm deploying to try to make sense of the kind of feedback data I work with, I usually work with qualitative data, and I'm usually very interested in students' perceptions and students' progress. But the learning theory mainly underpinning this kind of work is social constructivism, the idea that the feedback information needs to be interpreted through a learner lens, that the learner needs agency in what kind of aspects they're interested in enhancing, what kind of ways they're trying to improve their kind of work. And as I've hinted, dialogue with a peer or with a machine or with a teacher is an important part of that element. The idea that learners are co-constructing, making sense of the feedback messages, because unless they are making sense of them, they're not going to be able to connect and use them. Okay, I've talked a little bit so far about some of the principles. Now I want to try to address some of the challenges or talk through some of the challenges, which are manifold. So feedback has great potential, and if we look at meta-analyses or extended literature reviews of feedback, we can see lots of potential there, but also lots of pitfalls, lots of problems. Feedback often doesn't work. It often falls into the emotions and the affective factors of people not wanting to engage with feedback. So feedback can be very powerful, but the effects are quite variable. And we know from surveys of university students in England, in Australia, in Hong Kong, and around the world, that usually for students the most unsettling and unsatisfactory aspect of their learning experience is assessment and feedback. And these often come right at the bottom of the student satisfaction elements. So they're not getting what they're really looking for. So that is something else we want to be sort of probing a little bit. One of the big challenges is the limitations of teacher transmission forms of feedback. Teaching feedback as telling is very limited in its capacity to change learners. It's transmissive, it's one way. It's difficult for students to decode and act on. And I think if I were to suggest to you any pedagogy that was entirely teaching as transmission, you would say, well, that's ridiculous. Of course, pedagogy should not be teaching as transmission. But in feedback, it seems we sometimes fall back on that. And it's a lot of written information, either through text or PDF or online. And the students are receiving a lot of one-way feedback. And I've given a kind of face check to Roy Sadler, who's done fantastic work over a period of 30 years or so in this kind of formative assessment and feedback area. And another formative assessment guru, Dylan Wiliam, he likes to equate this kind of feedback with a bit like telling a comedian, you need to be funnier. Tell a comedian you need to be funnier. Well, it may be true, and it may be feedback or it may be information, but it's not likely to be able to help the comedian to make themselves funnier. And I think sometimes students feel like that they're told a lot of information, but they can't move forward with it. I think across all sectors of education, I think we struggle for strategies and techniques that can really reach the lower achievers. And I think feedback is one of those areas, and I wonder whether also learning analytics is an area, whether it really can get to the lower achieving students. And with this kind of teacher-driven feedback, I think there's a feeling that the students can't make sense of it. If you remember my learning-oriented assessment framework, I've got the student engagement with feedback on the right-hand side, and I've got the understanding quality on the left-hand side. Lower achieving students generally don't have a good concept of what is good quality in the task they're trying to carry out. And if they haven't got that sense of what is a quality performance, then it's very difficult for them to make sense and act on the feedback. I think maybe only peer support and the use of exemplars can be ways to tackle that issue, and I'll mention them a bit later. One of the other issues that I think bedevils conventional feedback sequences is that the feedback usually comes too late for the students. In modularized higher education, it's very common that their assignments, a large part of the assignments comes at the end. 3 or 4 weeks later, after the moderation and the quality assurance is done, students receive some comments on their work, and it's very difficult for them to act on that kind of work and for it to be at all timely or useful. And to me, this is one of the potential great powers of learning analytics. I think learning analytics has the potential for just-in-time feedback, for the feedback to come maybe before the mid-semester task or before the final task, so that the evidence can come at the right time for the students. In the title today, I talked about learner agency and starting with the learner. There is an angle that any model of effective feedback that is too teacher-based is going to be ineffective because of the wide variety of student responses. Some students want more critical feedback, some of them want more support and encouragement, some of them want feedback on one topic, some of them want feedback on another element of their work. So this makes it extremely complex that we've got such a variety of preferences for feedback models in the students. But to me, this encourages me on the feeling that we need to be very student-centered and we need to focus on agency, because there's no way that one teacher can ever tune in to all the feedback preferences of the students. So I think only a very student-agent, student-focused approach might be a way forward. And one of the studies I have ongoing, it's a study I started with some trepidation 5 years ago because it's a longitudinal inquiry. And you know, the trouble with a longitudinal inquiry is it takes a long time. And you got through 1 or 2 years and you've done a lot of work and you think, wow, 3.5 years still to go. It's a small-scale study and I'm following 4 students and their experiences of feedback over the 5 years of their undergraduate double degree program. And it's very interesting to see not only do they have so much variety within the 4 of them, but there's also variety over time. There was one learner who in the first year, she said, I come from a relatively humble district. I'm the first in my family to go to university. In the first year, I just wanted encouragement. I just wanted to feel I belonged. That was the kind of feedback I wanted. Now she's in her final year, and she's on the borderline between upper second class honours and lower second class honours. And she's saying, what I really want now is critical feedback to push me over the barrier so I can get the upper second class honours. So even within one student, quite different response to feedback over time. So when I started this research 4.5 years ago, I was thinking, can I find some generalizable points that I could develop into a teacher-based model of effective feedback? And I'm now realizing I was very much on the wrong track. And teacher-based models I don't think are going to work. It's got to be something that is coming more from the student. And I'll try and talk about that in the remaining time. So some feedback possibilities. I'm a great believer in the use of exemplars. But whenever I preach about using exemplars, teachers and colleagues will say to me, don't give the students exemplars because they will just copy or plagiarize. They will see them as the model answer. But what about academics? Anybody here tried to apply for a research grant? What was the first thing you did? Hey, who got the research grant last year? Can I have a copy, please? Okay. So we're not copying, but we're building and we're making sense and we're modeling. One of the strategies we use is to give the students a different sample, a parallel sample. So say they're going to write an engineering report, we might give them a science report. So they could learn about the genre of report writing, but they can't just copy all the information. The reason we feel that exemplars are so powerful in illustrating the nature of quality is because they show rather than tell. You know, with rubrics, your rubric, your list of criteria, it's got a list of very abstract features. But the students find it extremely difficult to make sense of that. But exemplars and discussion and analysis of exemplars plural, several exemplars of different qualities, an excellent one, a good one, a not so good one, and trying to tease out the differences, we feel is a very powerful way of helping students to understand the nature of quality academic work. And I wouldn't be amazingly surprised if there are not just 1 or 2 of you in the audience who enjoy a glass of red wine. but some of you may perhaps have a bit more connoisseurship, because the exemplar is trying to develop a sense of the connoisseurship that the expert has. The expert knows what is a good essay, a good oral presentation, a good project, a good poster. The learner is trying to acquire some of that expertise. And Guy Claxton calls that a nose for quality. And the idea of nose for quality is a nice one to link with your red wine. And then maybe many of you enjoy drinking your red wine, but maybe you haven't got to the connoisseurship. So how do we get to connoisseurship? Well, through experience, through testing, and through scaffolding. The connoisseur will scaffold some of the expertise and the connoisseurship. So that's exemplars, and I believe exemplars can be powerful for all levels of student, but I think particularly for the struggling student. Show me what a good essay looks like, and I'll have a better chance of being able to produce it. And the argument is that the understanding of quality goes hand in hand with the appreciation of feedback. So I've talked about dialogue with the teacher being unsustainable and leaning to learner dependency. So peer feedback is an important strand, but I often worry that we don't implement peer feedback very well. The students often don't understand why they're doing peer feedback. They don't know what good peer feedback is. So I think we've got to do a much better job of training and supporting the students in terms of peer feedback. One of the particularly interesting findings from the research literature is that composing peer feedback is even more educational than receiving feedback. Because through composing feedback, you're engaged in some quite deep cognitive process. You're making sense of a piece of work. You're deploying your own or someone else's criteria. Then you're making some kind of recommendations. And I think this is also an angle we need to sell to the learners. Because sometimes the learners will complain, my partner didn't give me any useful peer feedback, my partner didn't do it properly. But you can also learn a lot through this process of analysing and composing. And of course, it also tells you a lot about your own work. When you look at somebody else's work, you can get a sense of what you're good at and less good at doing. So the ideas of dialogue and peer feedback and sense-making build up into one of the slightly less worse papers I think I've published over the years. It was called Developing Sustainable Feedback, and it was based on interview data with award-winning teachers. And it was this idea that we need to enhance the student capacities to understand feedback processes, to generate their own feedback, and to use feedback to move forward. In later work, David Boud from Deakin University and Liz Malloy, now at Melbourne University, made a very powerful case for feedback designs. That feedback is not something we can leave until the end. It's not something that will happen by chance. We need to design our assessment and our feedback and our learning analytics so that they can inform the student progress, so that feedback is embedded within the curriculum, it's progressive over time, and there are multiple opportunities for students to generate and use feedback. Now, in order to do that, students need feedback literacy. You won't be surprised to know student feedback literacy is fairly thin on the ground at present. Staff feedback literacy is also fairly thin on the ground. And of course, we need the staff feedback literacy to scaffold the student feedback literacy. So by student feedback literacy, I mean the attitudes, the understandings, the dispositions to generate and use feedback for improvement. This slide represents work in progress. It's a paper that is under review. It's been rejected by one journal already, but it's gone to the next journal. And we're hoping for the best with our fingers crossed. We're sort of seeing 4 elements of feedback literacy. The fourth one being the taking action. And the 3 at the top converging on the idea of learner action in response to feedback. So appreciating feedback. students can understand what feedback is about, can understand their active role in feedback, can appreciate the value of feedback. The second strand, making judgments. So again, that comes back to what I've talked about in relation to the exemplars and to the peer feedback. Activities which enable students to make judgments are going to be developing their feedback literacy. And the element on the right, managing affect. By that I mean the emotions and the feelings and the dispositions, and sometimes the sheer hard work you need to kind of work with the feedback and try and move it forward. So that's a conceptual paper. We don't deploy any data. We do sort of literature review and conceptual, and we set out a number of sort of conditions and facilitators and drivers for effective feedback. So fingers crossed on that one. What I want to do in the last part of the talk is try to build some bridges between what I've talked about so far in terms of feedback principles and feedback research and feedback practice towards the digital space and learning analytics. And then, as someone who's been preaching about dialogue and agency and feedback, I will then stop and allow you to give me some comments and quiz me and tell me whether I'm on completely the wrong track or not. So I've been trying to do a little bit of reading around learning analytics over the last few weeks to prepare for this summit. And a paper I particularly appreciated because it seemed to be in synchronization with the kind of things I've been talking about. And I should say it was quite a long search before I found a paper that was in synchronization with the kind of things I'm talking about, because I think learning analytics and feedback are not totally aligned at present. But this is a paper from Ali Wise, and she was particularly talking about student use of feedback and how students could be making use of learning analytics data. And you can see some of the things that I've borrowed from her paper are things that I've already touched on a little bit so far. So firstly, this idea of design. I've talked about feedback designs, and I think the learning analytics researchers are talking about learning designs very powerfully at the moment. So it's the integration of learning analytics into the overall design of your module or course. The second thing that Wise talks about in this paper is the importance of learner agency. And learner agency, I think, is sometimes claimed as one of the strong potentials in learning analytics. And here it's through the idea of goal setting and reflection. And there are nice links there to self-regulated learning. Jen, in her talk this morning, talked, I think, about some reference frames and comparisons. And in this paper, there are 3 comparisons that the learners are invited to make. Comparisons with the expectations of the course. How am I doing in relation to the learning goals and the intended learning outcomes of the course? Secondly, reference in relation to previous performance, what we sometimes call ipsative assessment. And then thirdly, the comparison with the other members of the group. I was also very pleased to see the word dialogue come into the equation in this paper, because dialogue has been something that's been very pertinent, I think, in the feedback research in the last 10 years or so. And Ali Wise talks about dialogue could be with the instructor, but often that would be unrealistic. It could be with the teaching assistant, but more often it would be with the peers, so that they are making sense of the visualizations, the dashboards, the learning analytics data, trying to make sense of them, and then to plot a path forward. Then Abelardo and many of the colleagues who were in this event had a nice paper a couple of years back talking about scaling the provision of personalized feedback with Abelardo as the lead author. I just want to say a couple of things about that, if I've remembered it correctly. I think one of the powerful elements was the timeliness. If you remember, I've said that in conventional feedback, timeliness from the student point of view is a major, major problem. In this study, they got a midterm personalized email just before the mid-semester test that told them information about the engagement with the learning activities. So it was just-in-time kind of feedback, and it led to two useful outcomes: improved student satisfaction with feedback and improved achievement. Now, of course, achievement is we're looking for the effects of feedback, but I think student satisfaction is also quite significant in the context of what I'm talking about today, because if we want students to develop feedback literacy, they need to buy into the usefulness of feedback. They need to see feedback processes that are operating successfully. If feedback is always a frustration to them, then they're not going to want to do the work of understanding the nuts and bolts of feedback. So I think that satisfaction element could be showing students engage with your data, engage with your analytics data, engage with your conventional feedback, and then you will get higher grades. That's the way that the student mindset is driven. We want higher grades. So if we can develop processes that are rich in learning and also leading to higher grades, I think we have a potential win-win situation. Okay, this is perhaps a key sort of summary slide. What I've tried to do in this talk is to build on my main specialism of feedback and to try to relate it to something that I'm a newcomer to, the idea of learning analytics, and to try to see where we are in sort of synergies and links and gaps. The thumbs up indicates that my feeling is that the timeliness of the learning analytics data is a particular significant strength. I'm thinking that potentially the visualization aspect of dashboards can be attractive to students, can be possibly a different way of receiving data. And I know in conventional feedback, students find it quite demotivating and discouraging reading through a lot of text of written analysis. Thank you for your assignment. You were very good at this. You weren't so good at that, blah, 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 blah. And sometimes it isn't even very well organized as a text. And I think that makes it very difficult for the students to make sense. So I think the visualizations can be powerful. I think the visualizations in learning analytics also are objective or have a semblance of objectivity. You know what learners are like. When they do badly, they usually blame the marker or the teacher or the assessor. It wasn't fair. The teacher just didn't like my style of writing, etc., etc. But I think with the analytics data, I have a feeling the managing affect dimension might be slightly easier for the students. Another thing I like about the learning analytics work is the emphasis on learner self-regulation and emphasizing that, and I think that chimes very much with the feedback research and practice. My slight question marks, learner agency, I can see that there is a certain amount of learner agency, and I can see there's a goal for learner agency. I suppose I'm wondering what opportunities there are for the learner to request some data or information for themselves. So rather than they just receive the data that comes from the system, whether they can actually show agency or autonomy in actually getting the kind of information that they want, whatever information that is. My next question mark is to do with the learning theories. I've read different accounts of what could be the learning theories analyzing learning analytics in relation to feedback, and be interested in comments on that one. And then if you remember, I started very much with the idea that it's only feedback if it leads to some kind of action. So this idea of feedback effects, learning analytics effects, if people receive this data, whether it's this kind of data or that kind of data, what are they actually doing with it over the short term to improve their performance? And maybe even more important, what are they doing with it over the longer term? It's a lot easier for us to measure gains over the shorter term than the longer term. But surely in the context of lifelong learning, we want to see that learners are developing their learning strategies over the longer term. Okay, this is pretty much my last slide. So just to sum up what I've been talking about in terms of design, we should be designing feedback, and we should be designing it for feedback uptake. The essence of what we're trying to do, both in learning analytics and in feedback research, is to develop self-regulation for sustainable feedback. And the references are there, and the slides are on Twitter. Thank you.
Thank you, David. We have time for a few questions.
Thank you, David. One question I was wondering, you say feedback is only if there is an action thereafter, right? But there's also kind of feedback that you receive this message first, then you reinforce these messages a couple of times, and it takes a time until then really an action happens. So what do you do with these small feedback steps that still influence something, but don't really immediately lead to a certain action?
Yeah, thanks. That's another paper of mine that's under review.
Well,
it's not yet rejected. I'll probably have to wait 6 weeks for the rejection. But, in that paper, I talk about short-term feedback loops and longer-term feedback loops. And I also talk about ongoing puzzles. I'm not sure ongoing puzzles is the right way, and I'm hoping a reviewer or somebody will give me a better word. But basically, I'm suggesting in this paper, and I'm drawing on my 5-year longitudinal inquiry data, that the most common response to feedback is disengagement and lack of intake. The second most common is, I did assignment 1 on the course, I got some feedback, then I did assignment 2, and it seemed to work. Then the longer term, which is to me more interesting feedback, is when the students are telling me in their 4th or 5th year of study, they're saying to me things like, well, or when I ask them the question, what is the long-term impact of the feedback you're getting? Or are there any memorable feedback messages you can remember? Sometimes they say no, but sometimes they say, well, having been in this university for 3 or 4 years, I can see now that what the teachers are looking for is a bit more depth and a bit more detail. When I was at secondary school, it was more like the more points you have, the better. But in university, it's sort of depth and detail. So that seemed to be a kind of a longer term struggle. One of the other students in my study, she's very obsessed with what the teachers are looking for. So she's in that quality box. What is quality? And she always goes to the teachers and tries to find out what they're looking for. And she's been doing this for the whole duration. So it seems to me there are short-term feedback loops, longer-term feedback loops, and then these ongoing puzzles or struggles. And I'm suggesting in this paper that these ongoing struggles can actually be some of the most powerful things. But the feedback loop may never be closed. I may never nail how to do a fantastic literature review, but I may struggle with it for 10 or 20 years of different kinds of literature reviews. So I'm wondering whether the most critical and interesting feedback is something that gives you a puzzle, but you don't actually solve it, and the feedback loop is closed. And that may well mean, as perhaps you're hinting, that there is a bit of a flaw in the idea that you need to close the feedback loop all the time. And that's what I'm trying to do a little bit in this paper, of sort of complexify and problematize the idea of closing feedback loops.
You touched on rubrics. And yes, that's good and bad rubrics.
Yeah.
But it's a very useful way of managing feedback on some levels. Could you speak to that, please?
Yes, I mean, in some ways, in some ways the rubric is possibly more useful to the teacher than it is to the student. I'm particularly influenced by that ethnographic study I did for that book. And when we interviewed the students about the rubrics, we were surprised how negative they were. They said it's just a whole load of words, it's too abstract, it's too dense, they all look the same. And I was surprised when they said they all look the same, because to me the words are very different. But I suppose if you just look at the layout. So the students, and this was a wide range of pretty good students across disciplines, were generally quite negative about rubrics, but they were very keen on exemplars. They said, don't show us rubrics, we can't make any sense of them, but show us a concrete example and then we can make sense of it. from your angle, I think if you're thinking of are the rubrics useful for a teacher giving feedback, well, I agree with you. And of course, we need rubrics for quality assurance. I suppose my criticism of rubrics is I don't think they deliver very well for students unless you do some meaningful activities around the nature of quality and you're helping students to make sense of rubrics and to relate the rubrics to exemplars or samples.
We have a couple of questions online. Lydia asks, how can we improve literacy feedback? Feedback literacy.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
I think the ways to improve student feedback literacy is to involve them in the enabling activities that I've touched on. So peer feedback and analysing exemplars. I think if students experience effective peer feedback and can see the value of composing and receiving peer feedback and making sense of it, that will seed their feedback literacy. And also the analysing the exemplars, the having dialogue around the exemplars. So they analyse the sample, then they share the sample, they share their judgments around the sample with their classmates, they dialogue around the sample, then they dialogue with the teacher. And it could be done in an online system with an annotated exemplar. So it's two of the key enabling activities for the development of student feedback literacy would be well-implemented peer feedback and well-organised analysis of exemplars. But my fear is both of these activities are not always implemented in optimum ways.
I think we have time for just one more question, very quickly, here maybe.
Where do you see feed forward in the sense of constructive alignment? Do you have an opinion on feed forward constructs as a result of constructive alignment?
Yeah. I myself toyed with the concept of feed forward a number of years ago, but I have a feeling that it's a term that is useful for daily conversation amongst academics when we're trying to think of feedback moving forward. But I don't think it's a useful academic term because to me feedback, if implemented properly, already has that loop. So I've grudgingly come to the conclusion that the term feed forward is actually not a particularly useful one academically. I think if we did feedback properly, we wouldn't need the word feed forward. And a reviewer once said to me, just because feedback is difficult, it doesn't mean to say you need to invent a different term, feed forward.